Look at your bank account right now. Whatever number you see, subtract $105,000. That's what the average American household owes in 2025, and that debt is growing faster than income, faster than savings, faster than any path to recovery. This isn't a scare tactic. It's math, and the math is breaking. You're living in a country where total household debt just crossed $18.6 trillion, a record that keeps climbing every single quarter. Where credit card balances hit $1.23 trillion and the average APR sits between 22% and 28%, turning every purchase into a compound interest trap. Where mortgage debt alone exceeds $13 trillion and home equity, the last financial cushion American families had, is being drained at rates that signal panic, not strategy. This is the moment when America's financial foundation stops bending and starts cracking. Not with a dramatic market crash, with a slow, methodical squeeze that leaves households unable to pay, unable to save, and unable to escape. The warning signs aren't hidden in obscure economic reports. They're in your monthly bills, your credit card statement, your grocery receipt, your insurance premium. Every category of cost has surged while your paycheck stayed flat, creating a gap so wide that debt became the only bridge, and now that bridge is collapsing. Here's what you need to understand. This isn't about people overspending on luxuries. This is about a population mathematically forced into debt just to survive in an economy where essentials cost more than income can cover. And as the debt piles up, the interest compounds, the delinquencies rise, and the system moves closer to a breaking point that will reshape American life for a generation. Let's break down exactly how we got here and why there's no easy way out. The real number, $105,000 and climbing. The average American household now carries $105,000 in total debt. Not $15,000, not $50,000, $105,000. That figure comes from Experian's 2024 data, and it represents a 13% increase from just 2020, when average debt sat at $92,727. In 5 years, American households added over $12,000 in obligations, during a period when real wages barely kept pace with inflation and essential costs exploded. Break that $105,000 down and you see where the pressure comes from. The average mortgage balance is $252,000 to $268,000 depending on the data source, a number driven not by Americans suddenly buying mansions, but by home prices that surged 40% to 55% since 2020, while mortgage rates doubled from the 3% range to 6% to 8%. The math is brutal. A $300,000 mortgage at 3% costs roughly $1,265 a month. That same mortgage at 7%, it's $1,995 a month. Same house, same loan amount, $730 more every single month just because of timing. Credit card debt tells an even darker story. The average household carrying a balance owes around $6,700 to $9,800 depending on the study. And that's at interest rates that now routinely hit 22% to 28%. At 25% APR, a $7,000 balance costs $1,750 a year in interest alone. If you only make minimum payments, you're looking at over a decade to pay off what started as a manageable balance, with total payments exceeding $15,000 for that original $7,000 debt. Auto loans average around $25,000 per vehicle. Student loans average $35,000 to $38,000 per borrower. Personal loans sit in the $12,000 to $17,000 range at interest rates between 12% and 17%. And then there's the newest category that doesn't even show up in traditional reporting: buy now, pay later, which surged 47% in a single year, creating an invisible layer of installment debt that millions use just to afford basics. Add it all together and you get $105,000. But here's what makes that number catastrophic. It's not a one-time purchase like a house or education. It's a layered stack of obligations that all demand monthly payments simultaneously. Mortgage, car, credit cards, student loans, personal loans, BNPL installments, all hitting at once, every month, forever. The Federal Reserve tracks how much of disposable income goes to debt service. As of Q2 2025, that figure sits at 11.2%, which sounds manageable until you realize it doesn't include rent for non-homeowners, doesn't account for rising insurance premiums, and doesn't capture the full weight of BNPL or medical debt. For the average household earning $70,000 a year, 11.2% debt service means roughly $654 a month going purely to debt payments before food, utilities, insurance, or anything else. And for households carrying above average debt, that number easily exceeds $1,200 a month, equivalent to a second rent payment with zero lifestyle benefit attached. This is the trap. Americans didn't choose this debt. They were pushed into it by a cost structure that left no other option. The inflation wage scissor that cut America in half. Here's the force that turned manageable debt into a national crisis. The 5-year divergence between what things cost and what people earn. Since 2020, essential categories have risen at speeds that obliterated traditional budgeting rules. Food prices climbed 25% to 30% cumulatively, meaning your $200 grocery bill became $250 to $260 for the exact same items. Housing costs exploded 40% to 55% across major metros, turning affordable rents into financial traps. Home prices followed the same trajectory, locking out first-time buyers and forcing existing homeowners into higher property taxes and insurance premiums. Insurance became its own inflation crisis. Auto insurance premiums surged 30% to 50% in many states. Homeowners insurance followed, with some markets seeing 60% plus increases as climate risk and claims drove insurers to either jack up rates or abandon entire regions. Utility bills, previously stable, climbed 10% to 20% as energy costs rippled through the system. Meanwhile, wages grew approximately 21% to 22% during the same period. That's not bad in normal times, but these weren't normal times. When essentials rise 30% to 50% and wages rise 20%, the gap doesn't get absorbed by reduced spending on luxuries. It gets filled with debt. This is what broke the traditional financial rules Americans relied on for decades. The 28% housing cost guideline? Impossible when rents jumped 40% while wages grew 20%. The 36% total debt to income ratio? Laughable when insurance, utilities, food, and transportation all surged simultaneously. A household earning $70,000 cannot absorb a $400 month rent increase, a $150 month insurance increase, a $200 month grocery increase, and a $100 month utility increase without cutting into what used to be savings or emergency funds. And when those run out, which they did for millions, debt becomes the only mechanism to bridge the gap. This is why credit card balances expanded 3.12% year over year, even as people cut discretionary spending. This is why HELOC balances surged 7.22% as homeowners extracted equity just to stay current on other bills. This is why buy now, pay later usage exploded 47% in 12 months. People aren't borrowing because they want more. They're borrowing because participation in the American economy now costs more than Americans earn. The interest rate shock that locked the doors, the inflation wage gap created the pressure, rising interest rates turned that pressure into a prison with no exit. Between 2022 and 2024, the Federal Reserve raised rates at the fastest pace in 4 decades. That policy decision necessary to fight inflation had immediate consequences for every American carrying debt. Credit card APRs, which hovered around 16% to 18% pre-2022, rocketed to 22% to 28%. A household with $5,000 in credit card debt suddenly saw annual interest charges jump from $850 to $1,300, $450 more per year just to carry the same balance. Extend that to the average credit card debt of $7,000 to $9,800, and you're looking at $1,750 to $2,450 in annual interest costs before a single dollar of principal gets paid down. Personal loan rates, once in the 8% to 10% range for decent credit, moved to 12% to 17%. Auto loans jumped from 4% to 6% into the 8% to 14% range, depending on credit score, stretching payment terms to 72 or 84 months just to keep monthly costs marginally affordable. HELOC rates climbed into the 8% to 10% range, turning home equity extraction from a low-cost option into an expensive last resort. Even mortgages, the foundation of American household wealth, doubled in cost. The average 30-year fixed rate sat around 3% in 2021. By 2023, it crossed 7%. By Q3 2025, It settled around 6.57%, still more than double the rates that millions of existing homeowners locked in just years earlier. This rate environment eliminated financial mobility. Homeowners who bought at 3% rates are now trapped. Refinancing to access equity means accepting a 6.5% to 7% mortgage, instantly raising monthly payments by hundreds of dollars. The only people refinancing are those so desperate for cash that they're willing to accept higher payments just to extract liquidity. And that brings us to the most disturbing trend of all. The equity drain, America's last buffer, disappears. Home equity was supposed to be the safety net, the accumulated wealth that gave American families resilience during tough times. Instead, it's being converted into cash and spent at rates that signal financial emergency, not financial planning. HELOC balances surged 7.22% year over year, reaching $422 billion by Q3 2025. But the real story is in the refinancing data. More than half of all recent mortgage refinances are cash-out refis, where homeowners extract equity even while accepting significantly higher interest rates. This represents a fundamental shift. Traditionally, people refinance to lower their monthly payment. Now they're refinancing to pull cash out, trading long-term stability for short-term survival. Think about what that means. A family with a home worth $500,000 and a $200,000 mortgage at 3% might feel secure. They have $300,000 in equity. But if they do a cash-out refi, pulling $100,000 at a 7% rate, they now owe $300,000 at double the interest cost. Their monthly payment jumps from $843 to $1,995. They got $100,000 in cash, but they've locked themselves into $1,150 more in monthly obligations, $13,800 more per year for the next 30 years. And where's that $100,000 going? Not into investments or home improvements. It's paying off credit cards, covering medical bills, catching up on other debts, plugging holes created by the inflation wage gap discussed earlier. This is the definition of unsustainable. Families are converting their only appreciating asset into cash to cover depreciating expenses. Once that equity is gone, there's no reserve left, no buffer against job loss, medical emergency, or the next economic shock. The equity drain reveals something critical. American households aren't managing debt strategically. They're surviving month to month by burning through their last financial reserve. And when that runs out, the system breaks. Every generation trapped differently. The debt crisis hits every age group, but the pain is distributed unevenly based on life stage and timing. Millennials, now in their 32nd and early 42nd, carry the heaviest long-term burden. They entered adulthood during the 2008 crisis, hit peak earning years during the pandemic, and now face the highest average mortgage balances in history, over $312,000 for those who managed to buy homes. They're locked into 30-year obligations at elevated prices, with student loans still hanging around their necks. Millennials have more housing-linked debt than any generation before them, and they're doing it while trying to raise children in the most expensive childcare environment in history. Gen X faces the most immediate pressure. They lead the nation in credit card debt, auto loan balances, and non-mortgage consumer debt. They're in their peak earning years but still can't build financial buffers. Why? Because they're getting crushed by interest charges. High APR revolving debt compounds aggressively, and Gen X carries more of it than any other group. They're also closer to retirement, meaning they have fewer years to recover from shocks or rebuild lost equity. This is the generation most exposed to delinquency risk because their debt mix is concentrated in categories that explode when rates rise. Boomers face a different crisis. Age-related expenses colliding with fixed incomes. Medical costs, long-term care, prescription drugs, all rising faster than Social Security or retirement income. A significant share of boomers still hold mortgage debt past age 60, and rising insurance premiums are eroding what was supposed to be a stable retirement base. While they carry less revolving debt than younger generations, their vulnerability lies in essential costs that grow faster than their ability to pay. Even Gen Z, just entering the workforce, faces a landscape where starting salaries don't cover rent, student loans loom, and the cost of basic independence has never been higher. No generation is spared. The system is broken at every level. The hidden crisis, medical debt and silent defaults. Beyond the debt that shows up in credit reports lies a parallel crisis that's harder to measure but equally devastating: medical debt and unreported obligations. Americans owe $220 billion in medical debt according to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That's debt from hospital bills, emergency room visits, surgeries, chronic conditions, expenses that arrive without warning and often exceed a family's entire savings. About 40% of Americans owe some form of medical debt. 15% owe more than $250. 6% owe more than $1,000. 1% owe more than $10,000. These aren't people who got hurt skydiving. These are people who had a child, broke a bone, got diagnosed with diabetes, or needed an MRI. Medical debt is unique because it's unavoidable and often unpredictable. Unlike credit card debt, you can't decide not to go to the hospital. Unlike a mortgage, you can't shop around when you're unconscious in an ambulance. The bills arrive weeks or months later, often in amounts that destabilize even financially stable households. Delinquency rates reveal the stress. Student loan delinquencies exploded after payment resumption in 2024, jumping from under 1% to over 8% in Q1 2025, as borrowers who had 3 years of forbearance suddenly faced bills they couldn't afford. Auto loan delinquencies are climbing as higher rates push payments beyond affordability. Credit card delinquencies inch upward as interest costs consume more and more of each payment. And then there's the invisible layer, buy now, pay later debt. Because BNPL products weren't traditionally reported to credit bureaus, millions of Americans carry installment obligations that don't show up in official statistics. When someone falls behind on a $50 BNPL payment for groceries or a $200 installment for car repairs, it might not hit their credit report, but it still drains their bank account and pushes them closer to default on other obligations. This hidden crisis ties everything together. The delinquencies, the medical bills, the unreported BNPL balances, they're all symptoms of the same underlying disease. A cost structure that exceeds the income structure, forcing people to borrow, then crushing them with interest charges they can't afford. The childcare crisis that breaks families. If you want to understand why American families are drowning in debt, look at childcare costs. Childcare inflation ran 5.2% year over year, far outpacing both general CPI and wage growth. In many regions, the cost of daycare for one child now exceeds an entire month's rent. For families with 2 or 3 children, the math becomes impossible. Parents face a brutal choice: pay for childcare and have no money left for savings, or leave the workforce entirely because the cost of childcare eclipses the income from working. Millions chose the latter, reversing decades of workforce gains, particularly among women. The return to office mandates intensified this crisis. Remote work gave parents flexibility to balance income with caregiving. Once that flexibility disappeared, families had to choose between career and children, and many couldn't afford to choose career. Surveys reveal the psychological toll. Nearly 1/3 of parents report such overwhelming stress related to childcare and financial strain that they've considered self-harm. This isn't a functioning economic system. This is a population being pushed beyond breaking point. Childcare costs directly feed into the debt crisis. Families drain savings to keep daycare arrangements in place. When savings run out, they turn to credit cards. When credit cards max out, they extract home equity. When equity runs out, they fall behind on other obligations, triggering delinquency cascades that destroy credit scores and financial futures. This is how the system breaks families one impossible choice at a time. The migration nobody's talking about. While media focuses on immigration, the largest internal migration in modern U.S. history is unfolding, and it's driven purely by financial survival. Over a decade, states with the highest tax burdens and fastest rising costs experienced unprecedented wealth flight. New York reportedly lost over $500 billion in adjusted gross income as residents relocated to lower tax states. California lost hundreds of billions. Illinois lost hundreds of billions. High income earners, business owners, retirees, anyone with the means to move left for states where keeping their earnings was mathematically possible. The destinations? Florida gained over $1 trillion in income. Texas gained hundreds of billions. North Carolina added more than 500,000 new residents tied to financial migration. This isn't about weather or politics. It's about math. When your effective tax rate, housing costs, and insurance premiums combine to consume 60% to 70% of income, moving becomes survival strategy, not preference. The consequences compound. States losing high earners face shrinking tax bases, forcing them to raise rates on remaining residents, which triggers more flight, creating a death spiral. Meanwhile, destination states struggle with infrastructure that can't handle explosive growth, driving up costs there too. This migration wave directly connects to the debt crisis. Households weakened by obligations and squeezed by costs vote with their feet, abandoning places where survival became impossible. And this redistribution will reshape American economic geography for decades. The breaking point. America is facing a debt crisis that cannot be solved with minor policy adjustments or temporary relief programs. This is structural collapse where households, regardless of generation or income level, are mathematically unable to meet obligations using current income. The numbers don't lie. $18.6 trillion in household debt, $105,000 average per household, credit card rates at 28%, mortgage rates doubled from pandemic lows, essential costs rising 30-50% while wages rose 20%, home equity draining at emergency rates, delinquencies climbing across categories, medical debt hitting $220 billion, childcare costs pushing families out of workforce. Every pressure point reinforces the others. The inflation wage gap forces borrowing. Rising rates make that borrowing impossibly expensive. Equity extraction provides temporary relief but eliminates the safety net. Delinquencies trigger fees and credit damage that make future borrowing even more costly. Medical emergencies and childcare expenses drain any remaining reserves. The system isn't bending anymore. It's breaking. And there's no rescue coming from a government that's $38 trillion in debt itself. America crossed the line. And on the other side of that line, millions of households are discovering that working full-time, doing everything right, and staying employed isn't enough anymore. The math broke, the bridge collapsed, and the trap closed. Welcome to the new American reality. Employed, working, and financially underwater with no way out.